We're going to get going here. I want to remind you all to silence your cell phones. There is also, I believe, going to be a book signing afterwards, depending on whether or not the books are tracked down. I think we're figuring that out right now. So we're going to end a few minutes early so that you guys can get books signed before our guest Andrew has to get going to watch a football game, I think. Yeah. Alrighty. So let's get it going here. We're talking about Andrew Keene's book, The Internet is Not the Answer. So I want to start off, Andrew, talking about...
Since we're in Berkeley, I think this is obscene, this VIP all-access pass. So my only condition of doing this is people have to move to the front.
Yeah, come on up, guys. You can come on up.
This is ridiculous. Only in Berkeley, you're allowed to have VIP all-access pass only. It should be burnt.
And the lights are so bright, we can't even see you guys back there.
We're the disruptors. We're the internet.
Yeah, come on up. There's people in the back. Come on.
Come on. Don't be shy.
All right, thanks for moving up there, guys. Okay, so I want to start off talking about how you came to this idea that maybe the internet is, after all, not the answer. So you, in the beginning, you drank the Kool-Aid. You were an internet evangelist in the .com era. You had your own company, Audio Cafe. So what led you to make a 180 there?
Well, I don't know if it is a 180. I think it's... I don't think it's a 180. I think one of the problems is, maybe people like me are a little bit to blame for this, but one of the problems with our current conversation about technology is we like to think that there are two camps. There are the utopians, the people who believe that technology will change everything for the better. And then there are the dystopians, the so-called curmudgeons, the reactionaries, the Luddites. These are not my terms, these are terms which are used by critics who get associated with being critical of technology. So my narrative has always been interpreted as, oh, well, that guy was a utopian and then he became a dystopian. But I think we've got to get beyond that. I think that there are very few pure utopians or dystopians. There's, maybe Kevin Kelly, who's a sort of born-again techno-Christian. And I mean that in a complimentary way. I mean, he's a smart man and a genuine. I think he believes all it.
It's a great term, though, techno-Christian.
Well, it's what he is. Born again, though. I think you have to have the born again first. But most of us recognize more and more that technology is both good and bad, that it comes with baggage, that it obviously benefits us. I've got this is my obligatory moment when I whip this out of my pocket.
And by the way, he's been staring at it since we met up about an hour ago. So this is not a Luddite here, for sure.
But I think that, but seriously, I think it's all too easy to assume that people like me should be living in caves. I'm from Berkeley, so I know what it's like to live in a cave. But we've got to get beyond those that sort of bipolarity. We've got to get beyond the idea that either you're a believer, you're an evangelist, you're a .com entrepreneur who believes that everything's going to change everything, or you're a complete reactionary. I've lived through a number of cycles of this. I was lucky or unlucky enough to be around in the mid-90s. I happened to be in San Francisco during the first internet boom. I became an entrepreneur without any entrepreneurial skills. It was a wonderfully exciting time. And then I lived through the Web 2.0 period. Now I'm living through the sort of sharing economy period. So I've lived through a lot of these. I know the hype. But I would like to sort of distance myself from this narrative of, oh, you were a believer and now you're a skeptic. I always had an element of skepticism. And in some ways, I still think technology changes everything. I mean, Jaron Lanier is a friend of mine. I would say he and I share a lot. He also is someone who is a believer in some ways, but also a skeptic. So I think we've got to get beyond the sort of Christian eschatology, if I'm pronouncing that word right. We've got to get beyond technology as a religion. Either you believe in it or you don't. And I don't want to position myself in either of those camps.
Okay, so for people who haven't read the book, it would be great if you could tell us about the moment which you describe in the book in which you realized maybe technology was not the utopia you thought that it was.
Right, so I did have at least a sort of, for a book, a narrative epiphany.
An unreligious epiphany, since we're not talking about technology in religious terms.
It was, and this was actually more central in my first book, Cult of the Amateur, which I talk about going up to Foo Camp in Sebastopol. I actually live now up in Santa Rosa too, so I know, up in Sonoma. And Tim O'Reilly, who runs a company called O'Reilly Media, is a big sort of techno expert, entrepreneur, investor. I guess in some ways he's a believer. He puts on an event called Foo Camp, Friends of O'Reilly Camp, where people camp overnight. And this happened in, I think, in about 2005. And I went to this event, and it was full of extremely wealthy young men, young white men who camped overnight, and there was a sort of evangelical quality, I guess, to their conversation, where they talked about how technology was democratizing, how technology was making the world so much better place. And after a while, after a weekend of this sort of preaching, I guess I began to get sick of it and saw through it. So, maybe it's appropriate for a book. I'm not sure if it was truly a road to Damascus moment, but it was certainly one of the moments that made me realize that there was something wrong with this. I mean, if you're a journalist, you go to enough of these tech events, and after a while they begin to grate on you. They become really annoying when you listen to the same thing time and time again, and you listen to these incredibly rich, privileged people talk about how so selfless they are and how they want to make the world a better place, and they're lying. You know that really what they're about is making huge amount of money very quickly, and then buying up half of Berkeley and Palo Alto and San Francisco. So it's not hard to see through this.
It's interesting that you use the word that they're lying. I sometimes wonder who they're lying to, though, because you read these pitch decks for companies, and they really are like, this calorie counting app will save the world. And as a journalist who gets hundreds of these pitches for all of these, robotic vacuum cleaners and calorie counting apps that are going to save the world, you start to roll your eyes. But I actually think that the people creating the products believe it themselves. I think they're lying to themselves.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair point. The engineers aren't lying. I mean, they're paid to make stuff. But when you think about someone like, I think some of them are lying. So say, take a couple, Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg. Mark Zuckerberg, as I'm sure you all know, is the CEO of Facebook. Sheryl Sandberg is the chief operating officer of Facebook. And they talk endlessly about why Facebook is making the world a better place, connecting up the world. They promote something called Facebook.org, which is supposedly a non-profit for enabling people from the developing world to get online. But when you look at this thing critically, Facebook.org is really just an excuse to transform the internet into Facebook and get these people from the underdeveloped world who generally who don't have a lot of money and who struggle to get access, to make them into Facebook clients, Facebook participants. So they're bumping up the numbers in the Facebook community. And they endlessly talk about how they're improving the world, and they're not. So Facebook is a particularly creepy company. But then there is, say, if you use Google as an example, I think it's less clear. I think that the Google people do endlessly talk about improving the world, not quite as vulgarly as Facebook. But I think in some ways, Google is doing good work. But at the same time, Google is the heart of the big data economy, the free economy. They're turning us all into products. So there are different shades. I think it's all too easy to turn this into a kind of, again, since we're in Berkeley, a Marxist narrative of the evil capitalist versus the innocent working class. And that's too simple. I mean, Facebook is a bad company, I think, but not all the companies are quite as bad as Facebook.
So going back to...
I mean, does everyone agree? Is anyone here from Facebook? You all laugh. Is anyone on Facebook? I'm not on Facebook, so I can...
But you are on Twitter, right?
I am on Twitter. But that's But again, that's the kind of question that I get all the time. I come into these conversations, oh, you're against the internet, and then there's this silence, oh, you're on Twitter. And of course I'm on Twitter. I'm a writer. As I've said before many times, if a writer isn't on Twitter, they deserve to have their
right. And Twitter was really
their writing hand chopped off. And Twitter is a good company. Twitter, I think, is a company that really makes an effort not to transform us into data. I think one of the reasons why Twitter is not a huge business success like Facebook is they're much more honest, much more moral. So, again, we have to be careful here. We can't say, oh, all the internet's bad. Okay, I've written this book called The Internet's Not the Answer, which is a critique of the digital revolution broadly. But I'm not saying every internet company is evil. And I would acknowledge that some companies are better than others. Some companies are actually doing their best. Some entrepreneurs are doing their best. Dick Costello of Twitter, I think is a good guy. He's made it clear that Twitter has a big problem with bullying. Mark Benioff of Salesforce gives a lot of his money to charity. Now, maybe, he's a bit of a grandstander and he likes his name on hospitals, but at the same time, he's giving. So I think we can't tar everyone and everything with the same brush.
Okay, so when people talk about Internet.org, Facebook's play to get, so if people aren't familiar with Internet.org, the idea is that they will put a primitive version of the internet in people's pockets in places like Africa. So you would have a phone
for free, basically.
For free, and you would have a phone and it would have access to Facebook and maybe a banking website and some other primitive web features. So what I see is, yes, Facebook trying to get Facebook into the pockets of more people, but they also are giving access to, is there not a dualism there?
No, it's not a dualism with that, because they're presenting it as the internet. They're saying to these people, oh, you can get the internet for free. And then the internet they get is Facebook. So you remember the old days with AOL, where some of you look my age, when we all got on the internet in the mid-90s, we all got on through AOL, and it wasn't the internet, it was just basically a closed garden. It was AOL, and you got on, you used your dial-up, and you just were on AOL all the time. It's the same with Facebook, Facebook.org, is Facebook becomes the internet. So the thing is that Facebook talks, I don't want to make this totally a conversation about Facebook, but Facebook talks endlessly about openness and transparency, blah, 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 but they're the reverse of that. And one piece of advice, any company that talks a lot about transparency is by definition opaque. And actually the companies that most talk about transparency, like Facebook and Google, are incredibly opaque. We don't know, for example, the Google secret source. We don't know their algorithm. They don't publish it, but they go on and on about transparency.
So it's interesting to me that you describe, I actually read it as exceptionalism, kind of, that you describe Twitter as one of the good companies, because while they have
Would you agree?
No, I would not.
Well, why?
Well, I look at how Twitter has participated as a citizen of San Francisco in particular, and of course, anybody who lives in the Bay Area, you remember the Twitter tax break fiasco, and as somebody who covers the impact of technology specifically on San Francisco, I see them as a company that has not been a good citizen to its city, that one of the criticisms of the tech companies, and Twitter was a pioneer here, is creating these lavish cafeterias so that nobody has to go outside. That makes sense at Google, right, where there's nowhere to dine outside in Mountain View without driving a while. But at Twitter, the mid-market has great dining options, and they got the tax break saying it would be a boon to mid-market, and it has not been. So I cannot look at Twitter and say they're a good company.
Not for me to defend Twitter or the internet, but in my book I do talk about that, and I do talk about Twitter's role in San Francisco and the gentrification of the city and the reaction and the impact on rents and property prices and transportation and all those things. So there's about 50 pages in the book on that. But so Twitter bought a big building downtown in San Francisco. They are maybe sometimes disingenuously, but sometimes genuinely trying to make an impact on downtown. At least they're committed to downtown San Francisco. What Facebook have done, for example, or Google, Facebook has hired Frank Gehrig. They spent several $1 billion on an office park somewhere in Mountain View.
Menlo Park.
Menlo Park. And sort of turned it into a kind of Disneyland campus where there's no association at all with the local community. So again, I'm not defending Twitter, but if you compare the two, there is a big difference.
Right, but I mean, is this a batter for the lesser evil at this point? Is that where we've landed?
Well, as I said at the beginning, I think it's all too easy to tar all these people as being, the new capitalism, the new evil bourgeoisie who are ruining the world. And if you fall into that discourse, then I don't think you get very far, because you become a parody. Then everyone will say, oh, these are these guys from Berkeley saying everyone in Silicon Valley is evil. And I know that as a writer. I think one of the ways that you become more credible as a critic, which I am, as a skeptic, but not as a Luddite or a reactionary, is by being able to make these distinctions and saying, look, okay, Twitter's not ideal. Some of their behavior in San Francisco is problematic, and even the Twitter business model is problematic in the sense it's free, and they do appropriate our data and turn us into the product. But there's a difference, say, between Twitter and Facebook, and then there's companies like Uber, which are even creepier. So it's too easy to paint the whole thing with a single brush. And I think to have a serious conversation about the impact of technology, as I said, we have to get beyond simply reacting to all tech companies. And in the same way, Silicon Valley has to get beyond the vulgarity of assuming that all technological development is a good thing for humanity, because it clearly isn't.
So you mentioned one of the things that is problematic about Twitter is the idea that they turn our data, they turn us and our data into something that is for sale, right? That's how they make money. This is a central tenet of your book, that this is the problem with internet economics. But when I read that, I was thinking, is this really so different from reading a newspaper or watching television, in which the advertising is baked into the product as well? And as a TV watcher, I understand that. As a Facebook user, isn't it also my duty to understand that the reason I'm getting it for free is because the cost is really my data?
Well, there are a few people who are willing to exchange their data for a free product like Facebook or Twitter or Google. And they claim they've thought about it rationally. They claim they have nothing to hide. And they're more than happy for Google to know all their search habits in exchange for an extremely useful, valuable, essential. I mean, I couldn't imagine living without Google these days, although I don't have a Google account, so I sort of get around it in a way. So there are some of those people, but the vast majority of people don't understand the economics of the web, which, this is a book designed not for tech people, not for Silicon Valley, but for general readers. And one of the central tenets of my book is that the internet has made a huge error when it comes to business models. And it began in the late 90s with Google in particular as the pioneering and dominant Web 2.0 company of essentially appropriating our intelligence, our knowledge, our information for a free product, becoming incredibly rich through that, and then aggregating that data and selling it to advertisers so that we become the product. I think most people are extremely uncomfortable with that, particularly since these companies know more and more about us. Now, you made the comparison with newspapers or television. It's an entirely different situation. Sure, with newspapers, you have advertising. And when you pick up a physical newspaper, you know that part of the salary of the journalist is paid by advertisers.
And the cost of the newspaper is subsidized
right, but
by the advertising.
when I get my Financial Times in the morning, and you get your Financial Times in the morning, and not the Financial Times, okay, the San Francisco Chronicle, or whatever it is, the San Francisco Chronicle, and it's delivered to your house and it's delivered to my house, we look at the same ads. We see exactly the same thing. And with television, it's the same thing. We're watching the same show, and we see the same ads. The problem with the internet, and this is not only a problem, it's one of its great miracles, but it's turned into a kind of a nightmare in a way, is that it's extremely easy to access for these companies what we're doing, what we're thinking, where we're going, what we're entering in, what our e-commerce history is. So whilst maybe in a sense these are still advertising companies, television is driven by advertising, newspapers are driven by advertising.
Google is driven by advertising,
right, but
still. That's
Google
where
is
the
an
revenues
advertising
come from.
company, and the problem is not advertising. I'm not against the advertising business model. I'm certainly not against the market. I'm not against people making money through the sale of advertising. What I'm against is a business like Google, whose whole business is that of advertising, of collecting our data, and then without the consumer really understanding it, essentially selling it to consumers, selling it to advertisers. The same is true of Facebook. Even the advertising community is uncomfortable with this. After my book, The Cult of the Amateur, first came out, the largest advertising company in the world is WPP. They're based in London. I got an email from Martin Sorrell, who's their CEO, saying, I really like your book. And since then, he blurbed my second book, and we've become friends. They understand the problems with a media driven purely on advertising. And that's the heart of the big data economy. And we're still in the early stages of this. Think about it. I mean, everyone always talks in Silicon Valley of early stage, but it is an early stage in this revolution. We're on the brink of the Internet of Things, where everything, clothing, walls, cities, will become intelligent. By 2020, one company, Ericsson, says that there'll be 50 billion intelligent devices, intelligent things. Our cars, our homes, everything is going to be networked. So do we want to live in a world where we're going to be watched all the time? And in my book, I have my chapter on the data economy begins in East Germany with the Stasi. Now, again, the analogy is inexact. We're not talking about Big Brother. We're not talking about a single truth. But it is kind of nightmarish in the way in which this big data economy can become so much of the surveillance economy. And it's not just skeptics like me making this argument. Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, and again, I don't idealize Apple. They're by far the perfect company, especially when it comes to paying taxes and the way they treat some of their workers outside the US. But Cook made it clear. He said, this is not a viable economy. You've got to pay for things. And one of the problems is us as consumers. We've got to learn to pay for stuff on the internet. We should be paying for Facebook. We should be paying for Google. And in that way, then they can't have the excuse to appropriate our data.
So is that the solution, that we pay for a subscription to Facebook? Because I see I see the data collection as more complicated. And I am a skeptic alongside you, maybe not quite as extreme as you.
You're saying, I'm defending Twitter. You're the one you're more extreme than I am.
Anyways, but there's two sides to the data collection to me too. I think about what collecting that data has done for the ads that are built into websites. I am now advertised things that I would actually buy. The result, of course, is I buy too many shoes because I see them pop up on the side while I'm researching a story. So maybe that is actually a negative effect of all this. But I mean,
nice shoes. Yeah. Did you get those on the internet?
I did get these on the internet.
I don't have a thing.
Not Amazon though. I don't shop on Amazon.
Good. Well, I have a particularly dark section on Amazon.
He really hates Amazon.
I don't really. I use Amazon. I don't really hate them. I'm just critical of them.
Anyways, so I mean, is there not dualism to the data collection too? Doesn't it allow them to?
It's an interesting question. So, in the old days, you watch TV, and we saw the same ads. So it's the old joke, I don't remember which advertising executive said. He said 50% of advertising is effective. We just don't know which 50%. And the old argument was, I'm not going to wear women's underwear, well, not publicly anyway. And you're not going to buy a truck. So somehow...
I love trucks.
You
Don't
do?
stereotype
I love women's underwear. So, but anyway, the point about internet advertising is everything gets personalized. So is that good or bad, though? Do we want... And it comes down to something broader in the internet, where it becomes this kind of echo chamber culture, where we get fed back stuff that the algorithm knows we want. So when you go to Amazon, for example, it's not like walking into a great local bookstore. Unfortunately, there aren't many local great bookstores in Berkeley, but if you walk into a good bookstore, I mean, in the university bookstore or on Bancroft, they don't rearrange the books every time you go in. The books are on the table. There's a buyer there who thinks that these are good books, or Green Apple, these are good books. We're going to show them to everyone. And the problem, I think, with what you're talking about is this sort of echo chamber effect, where we just get served up ideas, products, advertisements, ideologies, which the algorithm already knows we want, which is ironic in the sense that the internet was supposed to be this global, eye-opening platform has actually become the reverse. It's become narrow and narrow. It's
So
actually compounding more and more of a kind of parochial atmosphere, parochial culture. It's one of the reasons why we have this failure of left and right and of different people, different genders, political opinions, geographies of people talking to one another. And, you know, I'm never going to buy a truck either, probably, but I don't have a problem looking at truck ads. And one of my problems when I go on the internet is it feeds me back stuff. You know, I buy a lot of airline tickets and I go to a certain hotel chain because I travel a lot for work. And all I ever see are the adverts for these things, which I already know, which I already go to. So I think advertising should be seen as content, should be much more open. So I don't agree. I think that the personalization of advertising is actually, not only is it creepy, but it's counterproductive for everyone, the store, the consumer, and the producer.
Right. Well, I'm not just talking about advertising, though. I mean, the reason analytics is such a hot field right now is because a company can look at how I'm browsing their website and the page that makes me go away from it, and then make it a more user-friendly experience. So that seems to me
user-friendly in what sense?
A better designed website. They can see the flaws by looking at how.
That's true, but you know, when you go into a restaurant or a bookstore and there's a problem, it's not as if the physical world can't adapt to those things too. I don't think there's any excuse. I think the central problem with our digital economy is the datafication of the world. It's where all the money is, and it's where all the creepiness is. And we see how it's impacted in political terms. You know, the Snowden revelations, okay, the NSA is slightly different from Silicon Valley, but what the Snowden revelation showed is that there was a very close relationship between a lot of the companies in Silicon Valley and the White House. But again, coming back, I don't want to sound as if I'm defending Twitter all the time, but what the Snowden revelation showed is that some of these companies were closer to the NSA than others. And Twitter was one of the few companies that actually pushed back and said, you can't look at our data. Whereas, again, my two favorite companies, Facebook and Google, were much more in bed with the NSA. So again, not everyone behaves in the same way, but it is this fundamental economic problem of the big data economy. And we haven't seen anything yet with the big data revolution, with the Internet of Things, with the fact that we're going to be wearing these devices that acquire all our data, all our health data. These devices are going to be in our homes, in our cars. I mean, it's no coincidence that Google is pioneering the self-driving car. Now, if there was someone from Google here, they would say, oh, well, we're saving lives. The self-driving car will be good for the environment. And those things are true. But Google isn't doing this altruistically. Google is doing the self-driving car because every time we sit in one of those self-driving cars, they're going to know exactly where we're going. And I don't want them to know that. And as an advertising company, it means that, you know, when we go past Chez Panisse on a Tuesday afternoon and they know we like it, maybe we'll get 10% off.
So just yesterday, I think it was yesterday, Uber announced that it was going to have clearer terms of service. Did you see that?
Yeah.
That their new terms of service, which launch sometime in July, I think, will be written in plain English, none of this legal mumbo jumbo. And this is the solution they're putting forth. Like, here, you can have a clear understanding of what is happening to your data. Is that's not good enough?
Well, I wouldn't say it's not good enough. It's a start. These terms of service, I mean, one of the problems is consumers are lazy and consumers are demanding. Consumers think they have the right to everything, free content and privacy. You can't have both. But there was a problem with terms of service when companies like Google and Uber and Facebook and Twitter can employ, $1,000 an hour lawyers who come up with 10,000-word explanations for terms of service. No one's going to read those things. So I think that's a beginning. I think Uber is a good example of a company that is now involved in a sort of a full frontal public relations battle to make itself more kosher with the public. They even hired David Plouffe, Obama's ex-PR person. So they're doing everything they can to make themselves more acceptable. Now, it's not clear if Uber is a data company. They could be one, potentially, but at the moment, their core business is not a data business.
Right, okay. So I want to talk about, in your book, you paint the beginning of the internet as this really idealistic time when these civic-minded academics worked for the government, developing the internet and then the web for the greater public good. And then you say, Netscape and Google come in and they corrupt it all with capitalism. And we wound up at this time that we're at today in which the internet is not the answer. And you suggest that the government may be the answer, that more regulation, that laws may be the answer. But when I look at this, not to say that our current system is not flawed, it certainly is, but I don't know that the internet could have become what it is, something that is in the pockets of 2 billion people worldwide without capitalism coming in, corrupting it.
Well, again, let me be clear here. I'm not against the market. I'm never argued in the book that the market solution was a failure. I tell the story of the internet very clearly. I think it's important to know the history. I think one of the problems with, especially the sort of the activist utopians, the open internet, the people who believe that everything should be free and open copyright and all the rest of it, is they don't really understand the history of the internet. They think it was just kind of delivered by a stork in the middle of the night as a reward for our goodness. And I make it clear that the internet began as a government project. Actually, it was a military-industrial project, came out of the Cold War. For better or
military-industrial complex.
What?
I love the military-industrial complex.
Yeah, exactly.
So warm and fuzzy.
So for better or worse, I'm not idealizing the military-industrial complex. I'm not saying that was necessarily a good thing. But I do stress the fact that it came out of universities, it came out of publicly funded organizations, publicly funded institutions, some of which were, many of us would probably agree, good universities, others which are a bit dodgier, like the Rand Corporation and the Defense Department. But I do make that point because I want to remind Silicon Valley, particularly the libertarians of Silicon Valley, people like Peter Thiel, maybe Mark Andreessen, who believe that government is always the problem and that all forms of disruption are good and that disrupting the government is the best thing of all, is that they wouldn't have their lovely toy, this shiny thing, if it wasn't for the government. So I think we need to remind ourselves of the history of the internet. And I do distinguish two periods in the history of the internet. The first was the public interest internet, the scholar-driven internet, the internet which was altruistic and non-profit and government, mostly government and university funded, which ended in the early 90s with Mark Andreessen's browser, Tim Berners-Lee's World Wide Web, then Mark Andreessen's browser. And then you had this explosion of commercialism, explosion of the free market. I don't believe we can go back to the non-profit internet. I'm not even sure if I'd want to. It would be like living in Berkeley. But I think we need more of a mix. We certainly need more, and Berners-Lee acknowledges this. I did a talk at MIT and he agrees. I mean, I'm critical of him in some ways in the book. He talks about the internet requiring a Bill of Rights. I think we need a Bill of Responsibilities. And the Wild West, Obama said this, the Wild West period of the internet is over. We're now entering the regulatory period where companies from, whether it's Uber, who need to be regulated in terms of the safety and security of driving in an Uber car and defending the rights of workers in the sharing economy, whether it's defending our rights in terms of privacy and secrecy, whether it's antitrust cases against companies like Google or Amazon, there is a role for government. Now, sometimes I say this in America, outside Berkeley, and I get accused of being a European socialist. But there's nothing socialist or even European about that. There needs to be a role for government. There needs to be a role for regulation. That doesn't mean that we shut the market down. It doesn't mean that we make companies like Uber illegal, as they're doing in France. I'm not in favor of that. But we need more of a mix. And I think that's why we need to tell the history of the internet, because particularly people in Silicon Valley have very short memories.
They're like goldfish.
Yeah, I mean, one of the ironic things about digital culture is it simultaneously remembers everything and has destroyed memory. So what we need to do, and this is part of a broader, I think, cultural project, is figure out how to escape from the culture of now, the real-time culture, where we stumble as a mob from one Twitter outrage to the next, where we've lost our collective memory. And that amnesia is not only a cause and a consequence of the internet, television doesn't help that either, but the internet has become, I think, the vehicle for both our culture of the loss of memory and of being recorded, of surveillance, of everything being known about us.
So I look at what happened with Uber in the Bay Area and California and how it was regulated, and I wonder whether Silicon Valley has gotten too big and too powerful to be regulated. If you guys aren't aware, traditionally Uber probably would have been regulated by the city of San Francisco. In San Francisco, that obviously would not be good for Uber because there would be more oversight. So they lobbied essentially to be regulated by the state where they have less oversight, and that was successful. And they have had less oversight with state regulation. So, I mean, is the government really going to step up?
Well, I think you have to distinguish between the Bay Area and the rest of the country. I think in the Bay Area, these companies are particularly strong because it's where they're based. That's where they often have the local politicians and indeed the federal politicians in their pocket. Many of them are funding these politicians. I mean, one of the things that troubles me about Obama, I'm generally an Obama supporter. I certainly would have voted. I don't vote in America, but I would have voted for him. But I'm really troubled by, for example, how he surrounds himself with ex-Google people. Everyone he appoints to administration in digital policy or technology policy seems to have worked for Google, like Megan Smith, who I've known for years, but she's become his chief technology officer. She's worked for Google for 10 years. So these people aren't neutral. They all come with a certain kind of attitude. I mean, Uber is a weird company in the sense that it could have been created by, not that I am a Luddite, but if I was a curmudgeon Luddite, it could have been created by me, this incredibly obnoxious CEO who's guilty of all. I've known him again for years, and known him when he was a much nicer guy. But
was he nicer?
Well, it's hard not to be. He was just another guy, another kid trying to make money. Now he's made it. But the thing with Uber, and I did a radio show about the sharing economy, and when you talk about sharing, it always seems to focus on Uber, on a New York talk-in radio show, NPR show yesterday, and it was based on call in and tell us your experience, and everyone who called in were giving the same experience. They were Uber drivers, they were Lyft drivers, and they had the same experience of being misled. The problem with these companies, particularly Uber, is that the sharing economy is anything but sharing. It's worth $50 billion. It's an enormous gamble by Wall Street and Silicon Valley investors who are increasingly indistinguishable to make a huge fortune very quickly. It's an attempt to create a transportation monopoly. It has no respect for labor. I mean, at the same time, as sure, they're hiring, someone will stick out their hand and say, well, they give people jobs. They don't give people jobs. They give people the opportunity to work at increasingly minimal wage. They mislead these drivers. They give them no insurance. They don't take any responsibility for them. So when the internet is not the answer, my argument is people say, well, what's the question? The question is, what should our operating system be for the 21st century? And the sharing economy operating system of all of us buying and selling our labor on so-called sharing P2P networks like Uber, TaskRabbit, Lyft, and many others is really scary. It's the ultimate sort of free market wet dream where no companies, there aren't employers anymore, there are platforms. And they offer people the opportunity to sell their labor, mostly by the day, sometimes by the hour. There's no security for workers. There's no interaction between the people working on these platforms and the owners of the platforms. The platforms are enormously valuable, whether it's Airbnb valued at 20 billion or Uber at 50 billion. This is $50 billion is $50,000 million. Sometimes people don't even understand what that means. I mean, those figures for most of us is just incomprehensible. It's fictional.
Those valuations are
but they're real. But they're
too.
real, and these companies will go public. And meanwhile, I'm not against entrepreneurs and investors being rewarded for their innovation, and these are innovative companies. But what I am against is this new economy. And my book and my argument fits in with a lot of stuff that's being written by people like Piketty and Krugman and Robert Reich, is that this increasingly unequal economy, where we're seeing the disappearance of the middle class, the appearance of a tiny ruling plutocracy, and then this underclass with very little in between, is both a cause and a consequence of the digital revolution. The digital revolution was promised to us as this platform, this opportunity for equality, for democracy, for innovation for everyone. But the reality is a winner-take-all economy. The reality is of companies that have no respect or responsibility for their workers, whether they're companies like Amazon that treat their distribution workers worse than Walmart, which is, Walmart is hardly a model, or Uber and the other sharing companies that won't take any responsibility, that don't acknowledge any responsibility, whether it's insurance or accident. So this is not a world that I want. The internet, in that sense, the world that's being sort of created, fostered upon us by the libertarians, particularly of Silicon Valley. And in this sense, I'm not ambivalent. I think that the libertarians like Peter Thiel are incredibly dangerous. Some of you may have read his book, 0 to 1. He's the major backer of Rand Paul, and he's a very, very dangerous man. He's brilliant. He's an evil James Bond figure. He's not, we can dismiss some of these people as idiots, as clowns, but there's nothing clownish about Thiel, and there's nothing clownish about this libertarian ideology coming out, which suggests that we free ourselves from regulation. All regulation is bad. We free ourselves from government. The market works. The internet, this P2P economy where we can all buy and sell our labor. I mean, do we want a world growing up where our kids are, Marx in the German ideology said the post-industrial utopia would be one where we would farm in the morning and sing in the afternoon and write poetry in the evening. But the reality of the P2P economy is we're driving a car in the morning, we're cleaning someone's home in the afternoon, and renting our spare room out in the evening. This is not a world we want.
So, in hopes of ending on a more hopeful note, I have one last question for you guys. That
was pretty hopeful, wasn't it?
And then we'll have time for a couple of questions, so get those rolling in your heads. Okay, so one of my favorite arguments in your book, that is an argument that we hear about once a decade since the beginning of time, is this idea that, this technology is taking away jobs. And it's true that it is. But, in 1930, Keynes wrote a brilliant essay, Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, in which Keynes is he's distraught over the idea that in the future there will be so little work that we'll just all be so bored and we'll be reduced to, he actually talks about how, we may suffer the fate of bored New Jersey housewives. I recommended reading.
We all want to be New Jersey housewives.
Don't we all? But obviously in 1930 that did not happen. The jobs that technology took away created new jobs. And I think that we're starting to see new jobs come of our new economic model also, right? Like Instacart has created a job that did not exist anymore, or did not exist before. It has created somebody who shops in the grocery store for me, and then another person who goes and gets the groceries and brings them to my house. That's two new jobs that did not exist before this current economy.
But they're not, but let's be, okay, so how much time do I have here? Because this is a really important subject. How much time have I got?
We have 6 minutes before this is supposed to wrap up.
Okay, well, but let me firstly briefly say.
Elevator pitch version.
let's be really clear. It's not, Instagram car is not a job. You're being paid by the hour. A job is something where you get security and you work full time.
But is it not equivalent to other minimum wage type jobs?
Yeah, sure.
Like
So
working in
you're
a fast food chain?
you're celebrating a service that allows you to shop for someone wealthy. I don't think there's anything celebratory about that. That's the first point. But there's two more important points than that. So you brought up Keynes, you're right, it's an important essay. But this is why a historical approach is so important. And these are two really important points. Firstly, and historians have argued about this endlessly, had there not been the rise of fascism and the Second World War, it's arguable that those jobs wouldn't have reappeared. So there was a certain uniqueness about the 1930s, and it may require another terrible war, not that I'd want a war to reinvent the jobs. America is in a less bad situation with jobs. Secondly, I got 3 points. Secondly, and these are really important, these are the core points, is it's not an argument when, and I get this all the time, you say, oh, every 10 years, someone else comes along and says, technology is killing our jobs. And every 10 years, they're wrong. That is not an argument. It's an article of faith. It's like saying to the environmentalists, oh, every 10 years, someone comes along and says technology is ruining the world. And that's how the right has historically dismissed environmentalists. And they're wrong. Sometimes things happen which are real. So we know that there is something called global warming, and it's ruining the world. And I would argue that the same is happening in terms of the technological impact on jobs. So it's not, just because people have been wrong in the past doesn't mean they're wrong in the future. It's not an argument, it's an article of faith. And thirdly, and here's the really important point, is that, the digital revolution is automating labor. Every old middle-class job, whether they're lawyers or doctors or physicians, they're all being challenged and perhaps replaced by technology. We're on the verge of just as we're on the verge of the age of big data, we're on the verge of artificial intelligence, a challenge to work. We're seeing it in many, many different fields. And that doesn't mean that there won't be jobs. I'm not saying that because a teacher will lose their job because you'll have a robot in the classroom, doesn't mean that that teacher won't have to do something else. But again, it fits back into my argument, and maybe comes back to the Instagram world. There's an excellent book on this, by the way, called Average is Over by Tyler Cowen. He's a libertarian economist, but really smart one, who says the middle class goes away with this automated economy. So what do? We have more and more people who are masseurs and personal shoppers. So this is something that's real. And this is the fundamental issue for all of us. I hope it will become an issue in the 2016 election. I think we're still slightly too early. But it needs to become an issue beyond events like this in Silicon Valley. It's the fundamental issue facing us. So it's good to end on that, but I can't be positive. I think it is of deep worry. It should be of worry to anyone who cares about labor and work and how we're going to feed and support ourselves.
Well, thank you, Andrew. I think that we have run out of time for questions, actually. So maybe if you have questions...
Well, we can ask a quick one. Does anyone have a quick one?
Okay, one quick question. Yeah.
I think my quick question is, how have you seen your books or your critiques actually impact some of the smugness and the talking inside their mouth?
I can answer that very quickly. Quick question. Did you have one?
I was going to ask how the internet is, what role it's playing, since we're at a book festival, in the book culture.
Okay, and final one. Someone else had one question.
Yeah. Is it possible for consumers to rise up and pull the plug on the advertising economy by using VPN or proxy services?
Okay, so 3 questions. I'll answer very briefly. There's been a big shift in the zeitgeist. I wrote, in 27, I wrote Cult of the Amateur, and I was really vilified, sort of joke about being the Antichrist of Silicon Valley, which was a fun mantle. But I was really on my own. Now more and more people, Jaron Lanier, Sherry Turkle, Nicholas Carr, I think there's a shift. And you don't have the Chris Andersons and the Jeff Jarvises of the world writing books anymore. Larry Lessig has disappeared. I think whether they were charlatans or not, they're not talking about this stuff anymore. So there is a shift. The book industry is surviving. Analog will survive, but it'll become more high-end. You've seen the revival of vinyl records in music, which is a good thing. I think book as a medium is just so historic that it will survive. But authors have been also undermined by the business model. Amazon is bad for publishing. Amazon is bad for small publishers. Amazon is bad for writers. I think Amazon is ultimately bad for readers. So the biggest problem in publishing is Amazon. Finally, again, it has benefits, but I have a whole section on it. And I work closely with my publisher, Morgan Entrekin, who's a remarkable man, one of the best-known publishers, legendary publisher in New York, who said, look, at first we liked Amazon. We thought they were the solution, and now we've realized they're not for a small publisher. Finally, can consumers rise up? That's a good question. I don't think that the VPN techie solution is real. I think that we need another Google or another Facebook. The only way this thing gets solved is through innovation. This comes back, I'm not against the market. I don't think this will come out of Washington, D.C. There are kids at Stanford, kids at Berkeley, someone at Haas, someone at Berkeley, Stanford Business School, will come up with a brilliant idea that captures the new zeitgeist, that figures out a way of how to get product, websites, web services that people are comfortable paying for. And I think that's the challenge. And I think it will come. And I'm actually not bullish about companies like Google and Facebook. I think in the long run, they are damned if they don't change their business model. And I think they realize that. So I don't think it will come with a technical solution, technological solution. It will be something like Pinterest that will surprise everyone. No one will expect it, but then it will capture what consumers really want. And I think it will come through young people. I think all too often young people are presented as digital natives and enthusiasts. I think the people who really get the new digital world and its problems are young people. And I think the real rebellion against digital will happen with the so-called digital natives, the 10-year-olds now have grown up with this stuff, who understand it, who are sickened by it in many ways. They're the ones who've embraced vinyl records, and they're the ones who will embrace some sort of post-Google solution.
I think they want to kick us off the stage now.
Good, thank you.
Okay. Thanks so much, guys.